The term the old regime was actually invented during the Revolution. It was used as a term to describe what France was like before the Revolution, before the changes that took place in the years of 1789, 1790, 1791, and what followed. Now, it's time to take a look at what was new. What was the new regime that came to replace the old regime? In this video, we're going to take a look once again at the official revolution to find out how members of the National Assembly reshaped France in the opening years of the revolution. Okay, let's get going. For this video, you're going to need something to take notes with, and you're going to need one very important primary source, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is perhaps the most important primary document that came out of the revolution. We're going to look at how the new regime came about in a few ways, but let's first start by looking at how the National Assembly reshaped French society. By the end of July 1789, the National Assembly was feeling confident that they would, in fact, be allowed to exist. So the question then became, what do we do now? Theoretically, two things were driving the agenda of the National Assembly. The first was what they promised to do in the Tennis Coat Oath, draw up a constitution for France. The second objective was a bit more abstract, and it was to respond to the complaints and grievances that had taken form in the various cahiers written in advance of the meeting of the Estates General. At the beginning of August 1789, these were the main goals of the members of the Assembly, but a third thing influenced their decision-making. For at the end of July and the beginning of August, the provincial revolts were in full force, and the Great Fear was underway. And it was becoming clear that addressing the systems of privilege that had existed in France was paramount. Indeed, much of the work of abolishing feudal dues and obligations, removing aristocratic privileges, etc., was already being done by the peasants in the provinces. The only question was whether the National Assembly would follow suit and affirm the actions of the peasants, or choose to condemn them. Well, the answer came in one of the most important events of the early revolution, the magical session of August the 4th. The idea for this session was hatched in a meeting of a political club called the Breton Club. The Breton Club was essentially a regular meeting of the delegates from Brittany, as well as other sort of similarly like-minded delegates. Early in August, the Breton Club decided that they would attempt to move the National Assembly in the direction of formally abolishing the systems of feudal privilege that provincial peasants were in the process of destroying themselves. Their plan was to take advantage of a particular moment. On August the 4th, late at night, when very few members of the Assembly were still in the halls of the Assembly, one of the members of the Breton Club was the president of the National Assembly, and thus set the agenda for discussions and who was called on. The Breton chair gave the floor to an ally among the aristocracy, who moved to eliminate the systems of privilege that he himself had benefited from as a member of the aristocracy. The motion was then seconded by another member of the aristocracy, and soon a cascade of approvals and additions followed. Journalists called this a moment of patriotic intoxication. Nobles and other members of the National Assembly swore off their hunting rights, their feudal courts, exemptions from tolls and other taxes, corporate privileges like protections from the dreaded salt tax in certain regions. The session took all night and ended at 2 a.m. the next morning. The many proposals were eventually tabulated and drawn up into legislation, and that legislation was approved on August 11th. The resulting law, in its first article, stipulated that the National Assembly, through this session of August the 4th and the law that came from it, had officially destroyed the feudal regime completely. It abolished feudal dues. Not that peasants were actually paying them anymore, but it did so. It abolished the exclusive rights of nobles to hunting and holding dovecotes. It abolished seigneurial or feudal courts. It abolished the tithe, the mandatory tax for the upkeep of the church, venal offices, fees demanded by country priests for religious services such as baptisms, and all, quote, pecuniary, personal, or real privileges, both for individuals and for provinces. Finally, it allowed all citizens without distinction of birth to be eligible for all ecclesiastical, civil, and military jobs. In brief, it deconstructed the entire system of privilege that had served as the foundation of the old regime. There was one other major legislative achievement that the members of the National Assembly succeeded in August 1789. They set their minds on an even loftier goal than the abolition of privilege and the abolition of the system of feudalism. They decided that they needed to create a Bill of Rights, a declaration of the universal rights of all citizens, as a sort of foundation for the new regime and for the constitution that would come to govern it. And so now I want you to pause this video and read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Pay attention to the things that members of the official revolution, members of the National Assembly, thought to affirm as natural and inalienable rights of all citizens in France. The National Assembly debated drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from August 20th to August 26th. Then on August 26th, they took a vote, and the final draft of the Declaration, the one that you read, was approved. We're going to discuss what these rights are in class. They're important. But right now, I want you to pay attention to the preamble written by Mirabeau. The preamble says a lot about how the revolutionaries saw themselves as the creators of a totally new regime. And here's what Mirabeau wrote. The representatives of the French people, constituted as a national assembly, and considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public misfortunes and governmental corruption, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, so that by being constantly present to all the members of the social body, this declaration may always remind them of their rights and duties, so that by being liable at every moment to comparison with the aim of any and all political institutions, the acts of the legislative and executive powers may be the more fully respected, and so that by being founded henceforward on simple and incontestable principles, the demands of the citizens may always tend toward maintaining the Constitution and the general welfare. First and foremost, they affirm that the National Assembly is the institution based on the popular will of the people. That's where their authority comes from. And second, they affirm their belief in natural, inalienable rights of man. And finally, they affirm that it is the recognition and protection of these rights that will create political and social harmony in this new regime in France. We are a long way away from Bossuet and Loiseau. Armed with a new Bill of Rights, the members of the National Assembly then set out to create the foundations of a new state for France. But this process of remaking the French state was not a simple one, because even ardent revolutionaries disagreed about what this new regime should look like. The biggest question facing the members of the National Assembly, and especially the Constitutional Committee, was simply, what role should the king play in the new regime? Everyone understood that in the old regime, the king was absolute. His will was law, but in this new regime, the possibilities were endless. Was the king still supposed to be an important political figure, or was the king to be a figurehead? Few thought that France should not have a king at all at this point. That would come later. But the spectrum of positions on what the king should be and what he should do was still pretty wide. Lodged firmly on one side of the spectrum were the Monarchiens, a political party of sorts, though there were no official political parties at this point, led by Jean-Joseph Mornier and Mirabeau. The Monarchiens really had Britain in mind and wanted to try to create a French state that maintained an important role for the king, but balanced the king's power with representative institutions. On September 10th, the Monarchiens proposed the creation, for example, of a House of Lords in the new regime, just like in Britain, but the measure was rejected overwhelmingly in the National Assembly. The Monarchiens did get their way, however, on a second matter, a royal veto. The idea was that the king should not be the author of legislation, but the king should play a part in approving legislation coming out of the National Assembly. The Monarchiens proposed a suspensive veto, in which the king could suspend any piece of legislation from going into effect for 3 years. The issue was controversial, and as we will see, many outside the halls of the National Assembly vehemently denounced the idea that the king could veto the will of the people. But it did eventually pass. The new regime would include an official place for the king in the legislative process. Further deliberations took place over the following year. Everything from the form of the government to checks and balances to all other matters were discussed. In the end, the new regime took on a particular form. First, the king was placed at the center of the new state. Freshly retitled the King of the French, and not the King of France, to emphasize his obligation to his people, he was barred from the power of proposing legislation, as the monarchienne wanted, but as explained, given this suspensive veto. The king's income would be determined by the legislative branch, and thus the legislative branch would have a measure of power against the monarchy. The king, however, was given the ability to appoint his own ministers, for example, the finance minister or minister of war, and he remained the commander-in-chief of France's military. The main representative institution of this new regime would be the new Legislative Assembly. It was a unicameral, meaning that there were not two houses but one within it, and a unicameral legislative body, and members would be elected by their local constituents to serve for terms of 2 years. In fact, the new regime would include elections for all public officials, including city councilmen, judges, and mayors. The only exception were the members of the ministry appointed by the king. The National Assembly also remade the judicial branch. They abolished the parlements and replaced them with new judicial courts with elected judges. They also set up a system of appeal from lower to higher level courts, and they based all of these offices on a totally new political map for France. The Assembly abolished the old regime provinces and replaced them with departments. I'll show you what this looked like a little bit later. When the Assembly finalized all the details of this new state, they inscribed it into a new constitution. They approved this constitution in September 1791 and then handed it to the king for his approval, which he eventually gave on September 14th, 1791. The first elections took place shortly thereafter, and the opening of the new Legislative Assembly commenced in October. A new France had been born. And this is what it looked like. Here's a comparison of the political maps of the old regime and the revolutionary France, or the new regime. Notice that the old provinces are gone. In their stead are 83 departments of France. Gone are the unequal and unusual boundaries and sizes of the many diverse provinces. Remember that provinces all looked and kind of acted differently in the old regime. Now, departments were all roughly the same size, and renamed generally for nearby geographic features such as rivers or mountains. The departments all functioned in the same way, with the same bureaucracies and the same rights. And here it's important to say rights and not privileges. This was the revolutionary vision, a unified, coherent nation stripped of special privileges, living and working in equality and fraternity. The decisions of the National Assembly in the opening months and years of the revolution were both a massive success for the revolution itself, but also a prompting for voices of criticism to emerge in France. In class, we're going to look at this a little bit more. We're going to take a look at the question of citizenship and think about and read about the many perspectives that people had on who could be a citizen and why. What members of the National Assembly did in the first years of the revolution was recreate the entire French state. They affirmed a goal in the tennis court oath of creating a constitution. And not only did they accomplish that, but they also accomplished the abolition of feudal privileges, the abolition of the feudal system in its entirety, right? And the affirmation of certain inalienable rights for all members of the French state. In brief, they created something very, very new. As we'll see in upcoming lectures, however, even this new state itself would change. For the revolution was not over in 1791 when the National Assembly and the king affirmed the new constitution. Instead, the story had just begun. Okay, that's it for this video. Good job, good luck. Remember to bring your notes to class, and I'll see you soon.